Welcome back to this next episode of this translated reading of the Tower of Babel. We covered the introduction in the previous video, which I would recommend watching before moving on to this one, at least for some context. In this reading, we'll be covering the first book, specifically chapters 1 through 3. To those that watched the previous video and left feedback of any kind, thank you. It's much appreciated. I'll continue with these types of videos and see where it takes us. In the introduction video, I hinted at doing an exploration of China and Great Tartaria, which we will explore after this book. I just felt it best to complete one project at a time. So for all those giving your time to listen to this presentation, thank you and welcome. If you are interested in learning about the Tower of Babel, you can learn about it with me. Let's begin. Athanasius Kacheri, Society of Jesus, Tower of Babel, Volume 1, digested in 3 books. Now this, I did translate the Latin, quorum. Instead of whose things, it actually translates to of whom. So digested in 3 books, of whom first were carried away after the flood to the tower and the building thereof. Second, the erection of the state of... Now this, I ended up just translating the whole section here, and it translated to the erection of the tower of the city. Thirdly, the Historia is contained in the division of languages and the transmigration of nations. Now I did translate this whole passage as well, and it translates to the following: the history of the division of languages and the transmigration of nations is contained. The things that have been given to the flood, to the tower, and to the building. Dear reader, Poft Noah's Ark. Again, we have the same introduction as in, well, the introduction. Now this term alone, Poft, translates to I want. However, using the first few words from the passage, it then reads as desire of the Ark of Naomi. And the mournful cataclysm, this translates to history. So, and the mournful cataclysm's history in the order of Moses, the servant of God, first narrates the multiplication of the mortals by the 3 sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, Japhet, accomplished in a space of 100 years. He receives thee. Now this set of terms, translated directly to the following: welcomes the bank of the city of Turif, a device memorable for all ages. However, if you notice the word Turif, it is Turif Q-U-E. It uses different typography but appears to be the same word in the Latin counterpart, similar to our title page. If anyone is familiar with this and why it would be written this way, please let me know. I did try separating the word and then changing the F to an S, and the passage then reads as follows: he receives the bank of the city tower, which is a memorable device for all ages, which he makes by claiming the faith of God. Now, there is a set of 3 terms, all capitalized. The first 2 terms, Dio, opt, or OPT, translates to God chooses. Adding the 3rd additional word, max, doesn't seem to help or translate to anything legible. I tried many variations and didn't get anything concrete. So in context, it may be the faith of God's choice of the unruly or the choosing of unruly arrogance. Unknown. Moving on. Of the unruly arrogance and insolence of the sons of confusion of tongues, and the beginning of the transmigration of the nations, all of which Moses Now this term directly translated to Genevans. However, changing the F to an S, it then translated to Moses, or Moses of Genesis. So moving on. And yet, men, how briefly, how very distinctly, the depth of all the things which happened in this arduous business, arduous just being laborious business. This term, changing the F's to S's, reads as success. So the success of time was beautifully expounded in a narrative complex for 5 circumstances, the first of which is, who indeed were the first mortals, who lived in the world for a time, what did they do, and what moved them in order the transmigration? Secondly, what end impelled them in their transmigration to erect the tower with such vain efforts? Thirdly, to what height should the tower extend from their border? Fourthly, what purpose did they have in the construction of such a large building? Fifth, finally, how they failed from the work, the rash venture from the difficulty of the divine God, and further progressing the punishment from the confusion of the tongues. How indeed perplexed by the confusion of languages did they organize such a transmigration into all the regions of the world. All that we have learned will be demonstrated in the context of this work. Divine goodness is added to our hands, so that we may advance with happiness, trusting in the theme of His unique glory. Of the affairs of the flood, over a period of 130 years. On the departure of Noah and his sons from the ark. If we weigh the actions of the first deluge, man with the same balance of mind, the right reason seems to dictate Noah's sons should be taken out of the ark, and after God's words about the blessings received, the creation and the multiplication of the human race, through the ark, grow and multiply and refill the earth, by the precept just meaning to give direction or as a rule of action or conduct, and blessing imparted to them, not at once to the bottom of the mountains. This term, changing the F's to S's, then read as to have left. Fed, or maybe said, which means various things, most likely but in the plains of the mountains for several years. This term, changing the F's to S's, read as stuck. So, but in the plains of the mountains for several years, maybe they were stuck a true and not washed away. No buffet, for it is also from geography, that in most of the most edifying, meaning instructive or beneficial, morally or spiritually, mountains, we find plains long and broad, just as the Alps, the Apennines, and other chains of mountains. After living in the world of Europe, experience teaches us, with cattle in the fields. Therefore, when Noah and his sons were converted, we were arbitrated. For when in the plains of this kind, which borders the mountains, they were expiring, of course, by the outflow of the slimy matter, and now the veins of the springs to this term, by changing the F to an S, translates to necessary. So to the necessary flow of water, which did not take place in the lowest plains, would be quickly and temporarily opened, and the plains would be rendered fit for agriculture by the inflow of moisture. Certainly, Noah better. Now this term, it seems to have gotten cut off, but the Latin counterpart reads as more convenient, for his skill in the knowledge of natural things, Although it is true that the text says nothing about this, yet reason seems to dictate, as I have already said, that this should be done by this agreement. For Noah, enlightened by the divine light, was born of the reborn world. He knows very well that the vast world of the world can be metamorphosed by a deluge. He knows, in short, how long, how many years, he would dwell in the mountains, until the plains below the mountains were suitable for the habitation of men, and this was done in agreement, that he might lead the beginning of propagation of the human race in the mountains, as if by a shelter, until he was forced to bring faith to the lower plane by the immense rising multitude of his children. Now these next sections I've translated in their entirety because they were pretty jumbled, so please bear with me. So, just a few notes in this section. I chose to translate this whole section because it was unclear, and the few notes, the term F-U-I-F-F-E needed to change the F's to an S, along with this one, set or fed, which I've already said in the last reading, and I think it should be S-E-D, which translates to but, as in it read as fed, but it should be said. Also the same treatment with the last word, which reads as necessary. So moving on, the passage reads as follows. It is certain that Noah was not in the least satisfied with this state of things, and that he was content with idleness, but that he continued to take great care and diligence in doing things well, and in the arts which are so necessary to the human race, by constantly exercising the breath of the soul. Now, a weird side to this, changing the F's to an S basically says Swiss, as in Switzerland. This is quite interesting because it reads as follows: constantly practicing the Swiss language. Moving on. And first of all, as God had commanded him by the words, grow and multiply, raise up your children to make propagation, and since nothing is more appropriate to the multiplication of men. Now lastly, I'm just going to go through the small sections on the sides of the main text, so starting from the top. The first men did not immediately descend on the plain after leaving the box. I'm not sure if the box is referring to the ark or if it is a possible metaphor. Let me know what your thoughts are. Next. After Noah came out of the ark, he did not immediately go down to the plains, but stuck in the mountains. The last blurb on the left side. Noah in instructing the human race in all things. Lastly, energetic in procuring the necessary. Nothing is more suited to the enslavement of men than the abundance of nutrients, to the end of which they could not endure life, being overwhelmed by stupidity. Above all, the reason of cultivating the fields, the children through the divinely infused by the, now this term didn't have a translation, however changing the F to an S, then read as himself, so possibly in context, divinely infused by himself or divinely infused by the self, unknown. As we have taught in Noah's Ark, taught the skill, so that just as before the flood, in procuring food for the ark and the animals for life, he had need of a well-provided treasurer. So also after the flood, in bringing out the food, and in bringing the food about the things of life, he spared no one's labor, as he who, this, the Latin counterpart translated directly to universal. So as he who maybe is universal, they were to fill the face of the world with transmigration. Thus, through this term had no translation either, however, changing the F's to S's, then read as successful. So thus, through the successful tradition of the arts flowing from Noah, fashion and reason, as if a rich inheritance were finished in lust, whence even if God dictated, they would spread the dew instead. Now these next few passages, I translated the entire section of the Latin counterpart just because the small text on the side got mixed up with the main story. So it reads as follows. Moreover, when, in order to practice agriculture, they needed other arts to cultivate the land, he was certainly the first in the Ferrara art, which he had either received from God or, according to the antediluvian, from Tubal-Cain, a smith in every kind of iron, and iron as, chapter 4, it is held at, now this here translates to Genesis, so it is held in Genesis or at Genesis. He had learned and trained his children, not even from the natives of the mountain ore, which at the time could not even be trained, but from the ironwork that had brought the dung inside the ark. To this end he forged of every kind that they could efficaciously: scythes, harpoons, flails, knives, and daughters. We think that the potter of any art, the 5 platicums, which were made of clay, such as pitchers, pots, shells, and the like, for domestic use, were, now this term, it got jumbled with the text on the side again. It reads as, we think it is traditional. So after this term, we think it is traditional, I ended up translating the rest of this section from the Latin counterpart, and it reads as follows. In order also to protect against storms and other injuries of the air, he prescribed rules for the building of cafes, huts, and houses, as he had seen and done before the flood. In addition, put all kinds of vegetables, wheat, ferrous, and dung into the ark for agriculture, so that the presiding deluge may occur on the occasion of the impossibility. He is able to live in the fields that are often fertilized by women, for how, if the provident financier does not transfer the dung of his daughters into the ark, he will be able to have women ready at the time. When the earth is full of dirt and silt, so quickly none of these to some, he will be able to say that I would like to understand the same about planting of fruit trees and vineyards. For how, even for 1 year, they could live with the end of fruits, with the end of bread, with the end of meat, sheep, and the rest of human life, which is full of skepticism, no one will be able to conceive, for Noah had foresaw all these things that the flood might kill. For the broken and the mourning face of the earth, all these are the rest of the future reborn world, and the woman of all things, the agricultural instruments, and the seeds of the fruit trees, and the cluster of the vines dung inside the ark, so that they end up with a further prolongation in the life of men and animals would use. And this is indeed what Noah and his sons, I apologize, this section is jumbled with some text on the side. It is lawful to throw away a woman's own girdle left, for heretofore he prescribed the rules for weaving of vests, for carrying the thread, for soaking it in water, for spinning it, and then for weaving. And he also gave documents for the art of spinning. Moreover, the education of hens and chicks was compared to the egg, and all domestic fervor, in short, was defined by this agreement. Now, this small passage here has a couple Latin terms that when translated, they didn't translate to anything coherent, so I did the entire passage, and this is what it reads. By this agreement, these first mortals want the deluge of the colony to die vigorously, which they had learned from Noah, into their homes as they had conducted before the deluge. Now this section here, I ended up translating, I believe, the remaining Latin to the end of the page, and it reads as follows. And these, in fact, taught the lustful fugitives the ways of life recommended by themselves to others and elsewhere. Now, before moving on, we will just briefly translate these small texts on this side of the main story for some context. So starting with the left side, this translates to the necessity of the art of Ferrari and the rest. Literally translated to the spelling of Ferrari, like the sports car. Next, this passage translates to the need for a carpenter's craft. Lastly, on the left side at the bottom, this translates to the necessity of agriculture. And finally, on the right, this translates to care and attention of wives. Chapter 3. After the death of Noah, with his numerous family on the mountain, he entered the submontane plain of the country. So what submontane means is under or beneath a mountain, or near the foot of a mountain or mountains. The time came, at last, when Noah, already the sons of you, rising up into a copious progeny, knew the lower lands of the mountains and various, this translates to regions, suitable for habitation, immune from all heat and excessive humidity, whence the plains were already divided into brooks and rivers. The marshy plains were already luxuriant with grasses, and the pastures were not so fertile in their fertility. He will find in the field a material suitable for the construction of buildings, and the bones of various animals, and the progeny of various animals, who, as is common to the imagination of interpreters, was that great man, scattered in a great variety of regions, who was called, as it were, now this here, it translated to 5 Persia, 5 Armenia. Now I ended up translating the passage, and it reads as follows. It was called either Persia or Armenia. Here soon increased by the incredible multiplication of men, lest a confused order should be formed by a confused multitude. Noah, the parent of all, and king, in 3, he divided the parts according to the 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, as if they were a certain tribe, so that each of the tribes would preside over this term, translated to himself. So possibly they would preside over themselves with the fullness of power and in difficulties and diffidence. Diffidence meaning lacking confidence in one's own ability, or restrained or reserved in manner. He went to Noah as if to the natural rent of the whole, in order that there should not be such a multitude. Noah, as he had been enlightened by the light of the heavens, so also before all things he led the greatest of men, to prescribe to them the precepts of life and discipline, to teach them the worship of religion, the norm of manners, and trust in God, and he would instill a feeling of devotion, rites in the infatuation of fabrications, according to the precepts of God, would be in the former times fervent. For the end of the divine God's affection in such a variety of the people does not know anything that is rightly infused with POF. This term here didn't translate to anything, changing the F's to S's, it then read to be able. So in context, it may be anything that is rightly infused with ability or the ability, whence having gathered into one the primitive tribes, such as we can imagine, we have received an exhortation, and we believe it. This here translated to advice nomi. Unsure if that's actually what it translates to. Moving on. To the three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, already established as the leaders of the peoples. I have confessed this to the congregation, O children. In the name of the blessed and glorious God, I address you today. Heed, therefore, my words. Perceive with your ears the words of my mouth, the words of truth, the words of life, the words of salvation. Finally, God's final judgment will be completed upon you, and after generations, do not doubt. You know the unhappy state of the world before the deluge. You saw, with me, the giant and the inhumanity before the deluge, the inexplicable perversity of men in every kind of violence and depravity, which exceeding the limits of nature at length arrived at that impiety from the wicked Sethian tribe with a Canaanite marriage. Now as a side, this was somewhat interesting. Some background on the term Sethian. The Sethians were one of the main currents or sects of Gnosticism during the 2nd and 3rd century. Sethianism attributed its gnosis to Seth, who was the third son of Eve and Adam, born after Abel's murder by Cain. Now, interestingly, there was also a sister to Seth named Norea, who was the wife of Noah. So this appears to be a clash of two different religious or spiritual ideologies. So in saying this, we have to be discerning and remember that we are reading this information through a lens or a particular perspective, similar to how each person listening may gather a different set of data points in relation to their own perspective from listening to the same story. So just something to keep in mind. Moving on. That even the God himself, whose nature is goodness, to inherit the world of the lost world, and resort to his will and compel it to be exterminated by the universal flood. Remember, lest I be mistaken, that I should neglect the care of men and souls, however much I was the most unworthy servant, as if I were the only one of all flesh, who made the right ways of the Lord with trembling fear, and from all the participation of others, he chose me to be sacrificed, so that he would be able to execute the commandment of divine justice against the wicked, the ark. And now these two notes on the left side, the top one translating as follows: the descent of Noah from the mountains into the submontane regions, today marked by the name of the Persians. The next one reads as the distribution of the three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The ark which, according to God's dictation, is for infinite, this term, changing the F to an S, translates to your, so possibly is for your infinite. The clemency of the broken man commanded that you, my sons, and the wives, who were afflicted by every kind of evil, wished to save the world from the ruin of the world. Do you know how much faith and religion I have betrayed in 100 years' work? How many accomplishments I have received from impudent giants, until at last the frequent exhortations given to them, now exhortations meaning urgent advice or recommendations, so until the frequent exhortations given to them about the imminent destruction of the world, the hardest bundles of, this term translates to persistent, so the hardest bundles persistent in the stubborn will to sin, at one time they all perished in an unexpected cataclysm. Remember, my children, how many benefits we have received from the Most God, both before and within the ark, and with all the living things of the living nature we have received, included benefits, how fatherly, this translates to universe, he has brought us together in his unspeakable providence, and has affected us both, how he has instilled in me what to do in difficulties, with the oracle of the divine voice, how at last, after the extinct human race, we 8 men, he had ordered this term is establishment. So he had ordered the establishment of the world, which certainly are such which from the origin of the world were neither alive, nor will they be seen by future generations. So that, therefore, receiving the ineffable benefits, ineffable meaning sacredness or unutterable, the ineffable benefits of this kind from the goodness of God, and meriting mercy in the hearts of others, long and night unbroken, ruminating with continuous assiduousness of meditation, we must swim. I will now proceed to the benefits which I may receive from the ark of, here is these 3 terms again. I don't understand this series of 3 words. I'll need some help with this one. If anyone understands this or knows what this translates to, please let me know. Moving on. He brought us plenty of greatness to advance. Besides me, you and your wife, no living man would be found on the entire face of the earth. Think and consider how he has made me the sole Lord and heir of the world. He has made all the fullness of the world to my power. He has deigned to preside over. Now, deigned meaning to think or feel appropriate or according with one's dignity. So he has deigned to preside over all the kingdoms of the reborn world, and to govern their peoples, with which, for so great an immensity of favors, I should render myself worthy and dignified by the actions of the grace of God. For truly, when you have already given birth to the human race through you, my 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, as if they were the only ones of the world, and not only the entire earth, the leaders of the nations, after the propagation of the nations, have risen up in the hereafter a numerous tribe, that they may become one. We cannot stay here. You should not be born in such a profusion of sons and grandsons and brothers. You, I say, as if I had been divided into certain tribes. And Shem, the firstborn, whom I took by the miracle of God 100 years before the flood, was to take care of his children and his grandchildren. Japheth becomes both prince and master of his descendants. Ham was true in his generation, and he obtained dominion. This one exhorting you that you should not be abused by mixed marriages. Now this next sentence, I had to translate the entire passage because it didn't translate correctly. It reads as follows: but every one who, or the offspring of the race, should be governed by a paternal, not tyrannical administration. Disputes arising out of different parties should be settled by authority, since with the true end of the divine deity's protection, neither the kingdom nor the rulers could long, this term here translates to subsist or continue in existence. I predestined you to hold that religion before all things, which of the one true living God, the founder of the world and the ruler of all things, Seth, the son of Hades, our fathers from the beginning of the world, in a continuous tradition, and until he taught me the 10th from Adam, come together, inscribe this in the innermost hearts of the 2 tablets, so that his memory may never be forgotten in you. For from this I would like to depend the last of my actions, and my life to be well and happily transfixed. For when throughout the whole world, for his infinite goodness and mercy, he has indeed willed us to be, this translated to survivors. So in context, maybe he has indeed willed us to be surviving children, or the survived children, that which was done for that purpose, that this same rule of religion which I have prescribed for you, not only you worshipping with great fervor of soul, this term, FED, I'm unsure if I've given an explanation for what this is. It is usually SED when you're translating, but it is essentially a conjunction or a joiner of sentences. I believe that is correct. If not, let me know below. So it translates to many different things. I will try my best to pick the most appropriate term and move on. Yet with great solicitude, meaning anxiety or care, to the children you will propagate your grandchildren. The agitation of my beloved Son, the worship of the divine deity, without ever interrupting at any time, prayers and prayers, which nothing can be more acceptable to our God, in the same way that he can force me to act outside the ark. Riches, with equal fervor, with all, this translates to superstition, and the next term translates to outlawed. With all superstition outlawed, carry out the fated times, keep peace and harmony among yourselves, as if you were the only true source of happiness. In the times of thee, the barns shall be filled with corn and grain, abundance of oil, and wine shall overflow the scanty corn, and ye shall drink the abundance of all good things. If you have infuriated God with the impetus and swift enormity of your mind, you will bring him from you 1,000 kinds of calamities because of the stubbornness of your mind, and your profligate, meaning utterly and shamelessly immoral. So your profligate license to sin, when you have spent these things, you have weighed them down on your chest. And if these things ever happen to you, remember that I foretold them to you. live happily, remembering my words, that the blessing of God may be done through you, and that what I have thought to be done through you may be accomplished. That concludes this episode, being the first 3 chapters of the first book in this tome. A very interesting beginning to this story of the Tower of Babel. I truly hope that you enjoyed this reading and picked up some gems of information. There certainly is wisdom and much detail regarding this cataclysmic flood thus far. In the next episode, we will be continuing our reading into chapters 4 through 6. Chapter 4 being titled, On the Multiplication of the Human Race, from the Flood to the Building of the Tower. If you stayed through the entire presentation, thank you. It is greatly appreciated. If you gained any value from it whatsoever, give it a like. Let me know what your thoughts are below on anything discussed in this presentation. So, if you would like to continue to learn about the Tower of Babel, you can learn about it with me.